Nos acompaña el doctor Hans van Dongen. Él viene de la Universidad Estatal de Washington en Spokane. El doctor tiene una carrera impresionante en el estudio de privación de sueño y en humanos específicamente, y muchas de las becas y trabajos que ha realizado han sido apoyados por la NASA, por toda la parte de política de gobierno, Estados Unidos. Entonces, pues nos va a presentar justamente esta cuestión de su investigación en relación con trabajadores nocturnos, con la parte de cognitive performance, bueno, de la parte cognitiva, y también pues las implicaciones que tiene sobre la salud. ¿Okay? Entonces, al final, siéntanse libres si quieren preguntar algo en español, se lo podemos traducir, no hay ningún problema. Entonces, por favor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for having me here. I would like to thank the organizers for this great opportunity to be in Mexico, one of my favorite countries for sure. So thank you for having me here. This is a wonderful place in the world, not only for your great hospitality, for the great food, for the great company that I have when I'm here, but also because it really illustrates my point very well. If I can get my slide on the screen, which I don't know how to do. It was just there. There we go. Ah, keeps disappearing. Stay. If I'm not mistaken. Wow. We'll give this a second for technical difficulties. What I was about to show you, which would have been such a wonderful thing to show, is that, as you all know, we as humans have chosen to spend a lot of time being awake at night, right? Working through the night, staying up at night, having a great time with other people at night. But also, people that work in hospitals have to take care of patients at night. Or the people that keep our electricity on at night. The list of people that need to be up and about working at night is endless. And I wanted to illustrate, and maybe I'll get a chance to do that in a minute. You can see that from space, because when we light up the Earth, when we light up where we live so that we can work at night, it actually shows these beautiful spots from space where you can see where all these people are awake. And across the entire world, we find people being awake at night. But especially here in Mexico City, we find a lot of people being active at night. So I thought this is just a wonderful place to talk about being awake at night and not getting enough sleep, because many of you experience it every day. There's only one phone. And so when we are awake at night and we are not sleeping, that has consequences for our daytime performance, for our ability to work and to be free of accidents. And that's what I'm going to talk about in hopefully a minute or so. As you can see how this computer works, is how we are right here at this beautiful bright spot. That means too many people are awake at night. I'm going to skip this slide because we talked about that a little bit already. But I want to show you a little bit about what actually happens when we do this, right? And one of the places where you can go to see what happens when we're awake at night, what the consequences are, is go to any hospital. Because hospitals, of course, take care of patients 24 hours a day. And if you have nurses in the United States, nurses typically work 12-hour shifts these days. I imagine it's a similar system here, maybe a little bit different. But when you alternate these shifts, even if people sleep enough, if they try to make up for sleep during the day, that has consequences. And we can see that in this graph here. This is Karolinska's sleepiness scale, just a self-rating of sleepiness. This is very alert. This is pretty sleepy. It's not terribly sleepy, but it's sleepy. And we asked the nurses in this study to rate their sleepiness at the beginning, the middle, and the end of their 12-hour shift. And so in the orange color here, you see the day shift nurses. And they start the day a little bit sleepy because they just got out of bed and it's early in the day. And then it gets in the middle of the day, it's pretty good. Towards the end of the day, they've had a long shift and they've done a lot of work. And so now they're a little bit sleepy. But if you look at what happens to people at night, they actually start the night shift pretty okay. But then towards the end of the shift, it's much worse, right? But that's just subjective. That's just how they feel. If you now ask them to do a performance task, a reaction time task, you see that the nurses that are awake during the day and are doing the shift during the day, they're actually very steady and making very few what we call lapses. Lapses of attention is when they're looking at the screen and they're missing the stimulus for more than half a second. It's twice as long as you would normally be able to do. So we call that a lapse, but they have very few of those. But in the night shift, we see a pretty big escalation of that number of lapses, right? So that's the number of times when they fail to register that there was a stimulus. And if you imagine that you're taking care of a patient or that there's a machine that you're supposed to monitor, then that can have potential consequences. This works too. But I want to illustrate this with outside of the hospital in transportation accident, for instance. This is from the Metro North train crash in New York. It's quite a while ago now, but killed 4 people and cost about $80 million worth of damage for a train driver who just was speeding by quite a bit in a trajectory where they were supposed to slow down, and they completely missed the sign. And what happened in this particular incident is very illustrative of what's going on with all of us when we're trying to stay awake and not getting enough sleep. So this particular driver actually had a very early start of the shift. In New York, you have to get up really early to actually make it through traffic to get to your destination. I think you are probably all familiar with that problem too. So here's the person's circadian drive for wakefulness. So it's a high drive for wakefulness in the late afternoon, and then a very low drive for wakefulness in the night period and the early morning hours, and then it picks up again. And this person now had to get up at around 3 or 4 a.m. to make it to their shift, right? This was actually not even a night shift. This was just a regular day shift, but they had to get up really early. And so they were building up in the night before, they were building up this pressure for sleep from being awake. Here's where they were supposed to go to bed if they wanted to get 8 hours of sleep for that night. But of course, the circadian drive is still high. So, and the pressure for sleep hadn't built up enough yet. So they didn't actually fall asleep at all. They were basically in bed, staring at the ceiling. Nothing happened. They weren't getting any sleep until about 11 p.m. or so. And now here's the fatigue levels that are caused by the drive for wakefulness and the homeostatic drive for sleep at the same time. So it gets worse and worse and worse. And then now the person is asleep. And so you start to see that fatigue levels dissipate, because that's what sleep will do for us. But then this alarm goes off. The person needs to get out of bed, and the next day start, and you see that they haven't really slept off all of their fatigue yet. There's still this residual level of homeostatic drive for sleep, as we would say, in their system. And their circadian system hasn't really picked up yet. It's at its low point. And so now you take these two curves, you add them up again, and you see, you get this curve of fatigue. And where did the accident happen? Where did this happen? Right at that point where the fatigue was the highest, based on the simple addition of our biological drive for wakefulness from the circadian pacemaker, which really wasn't very active at that point, and the homeostatic drive for sleep from our fact that we are awake and haven't been sleeping enough. So that's how these consequences play out. Now, of course, it's a tragic accident, but it's also a beautiful example, because it just plays out exactly like the biology would tell you it would. Not every accident is exactly that way, of course. Sometimes it's a little bit messier in the real world. But I like to show this example because the consequences of something very simple, from simple biology that we can fully understand, are very dramatic. And every one of us faces these potential consequences every day. But it gets a little bit more dramatic if we're not just talking about one single night, but we're talking about lots of nights with not enough sleep. And so this is some older data that I'm going to start with. I promise I will show you some new data a little bit later. But it's data from a study that was done at the University of Pennsylvania under leadership of David Dinges, whom I was working with at the time. And we had people in the lab for 20 days. And out of those 20 days, for 14 days, they were being sleep restricted to either 8 hours time in bed, which was basically normal sleep, or 6 hours time in bed, so losing 2 hours of the night every night, or just 4 hours time in bed. In other words, only getting about half the sleep that you would typically need. And the data from this experiment are shown here. So in the 8-hour time in bed condition, the control condition, we see this is now, again, the number of lapses on this reaction time task. So up on this graph is worse performance. If you get 8 hours time in bed, you're not perfectly stable because 8 hours is not exactly 8 hours of sleep. That's about 7.2 hours of actual sleep, which is not entirely enough. But by and large, with 8 hours time in bed, you can keep pretty steady performance level across these 14 days. But if you only got 6 hours time in bed per day, then we start to see a buildup of impairment, on average impairment across every day, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And with only 4 hours time in bed, it gets worse even faster, right? You end up over here. But now, how bad does it actually get? Well, we also had a group of people in the lab that were not getting any sleep whatsoever for 3 days straight, right? So 1 night with no sleep, 2 nights with no sleep, and 3 nights with no sleep. Does anybody know how it feels like to not have sleep for 3 nights at all in a row? Good. Don't try this at home. But you can tell that after 14 days with 4 hours time in bed, you reach about the same level of impairment as somebody who hasn't slept for 2 or 3 nights at all. So that is quite a significant level of impairment. But bizarrely, when we also asked these people, how do you feel? How are you sleeping? Well, the group in the 8 hours time in bed, they weren't sleepy because they were fine. And the group that did get no sleep whatsoever, 1, 2, and 3 nights with no sleep at all, they were not fine. They were very, very, very sleepy. But the 6-hour and the 4-hour groups, they were not great, but then it leveled out. Then they didn't really show much of a buildup anymore. They didn't really feel that things were getting worse and worse and worse. And to make matters worse, it didn't really make a difference much if they're getting only 6 hours of sleep or even getting only 4 hours of sleep. It did not make much of a difference either. So what you can tell from that is that the performance impairment that they were experiencing, they weren't actually recognizing that subjectively, how bad it actually got. And I would imagine, because I know I'm just like you and everybody else. We do this all the time, right? We do this to ourselves all the time. I imagine one of the reasons we do this is because it doesn't register that we're actually causing problems for ourselves. We don't feel it that way, right? And so that makes it actually even more dangerous. The other thing that's peculiar about this is from data from Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, which had conducted a study similar to ours at the same time. But this one had 9 hours time in bed, which is actually quite enough. That's plenty. Or 7, which is not quite enough. Or 5 hours time in bed per day. Or just 3, which is absolutely not enough, right? And then they had 3 days for recovery, like a long weekend, like a holiday weekend. And they got 8 hours time in bed per day for that period. And then you can see that none of these sleep-restricted conditions, not the 3, not the 5, nor the 7, ever made it back to levels of baseline where the 9-hour people were. They were very slow to recuperate. They didn't really get back to baseline. And I'll get back to that point because there's something funny about that. But before I do that, I want to show you another experiment. This is much, much newer data that only got published a couple months ago. This is from a similar experiment. People were in the lab at a baseline day, and then they had 5 days with only 4 hours time in bed, like the red curve that you've seen before. But then we gave them a night with very low amounts of sleep. Either they got 12 hours of sleep. So that's a good night. That's a really good night to get some recuperation, right? So 12 hours of sleep, sleeping in like on the weekend. Or 10 hours, or 8 hours, or 6 hours, or 4 hours, or 2 hours, or no sleep at all, making things much worse. Well, we know what happens with the 4 hours because that's just day number 6 on the previous experiment, right? And that's approximately exactly where that point ends up. And of course, with 2 hours, you actually make things worse. And if you had 5 days with insufficient sleep and then you get no sleep at all, then it gets really, really bad. You don't want that. But of course, if you get more sleep, if you get even if you get 6 hours, which is interesting, you get 6 hours, which is not enough, but it still helps you to get better after 4, right? If you had 4 before, which is an interesting thought, because how is that possible? Because 6 wasn't supposed to be enough. It should have gotten worse, but it hasn't. It's getting better a little bit. And of course, if you get 8 or 10 or 12, then you're pretty much okay. But now, does this mean that if you get 12 hours and I would then subsequently give you another week with insufficient sleep, is this going to repeat itself? Is the pattern just going to be the same? Or does something else happen? Well, let me tell you. This doesn't look like this at all. What actually happened was the people who had only had 12 hours of sleep, so they had plenty of rest, right? They actually, it turns out that wasn't really all really full recovery, because they go back to a much poorer schedule pretty quickly. They didn't really actually recuperate. There was something still in their system that said, you're actually still really tired. You're just okay for now, but you're not really okay for the long run. And the same for the 8 and the 10 and the 8 and the 6 condition. The 4-hour condition, of course, does what we would expect. But the other really bizarre thing that happened here is that if you got 0 hours, which made it way, way, way worse, but then you went back to a 4-hour schedule, it was like that they never happened. This is really bizarre, because everything we know about sleep and not getting sleep and what it does to the brain should have told you that this group should have now continued from here and just getting worse and worse and worse. But that's not what happened. They're just basically, all of these groups are basically continuing the trajectory that they were on with just a little bit of a difference from the prior night. So what this really tells you is that what the brain is trying to track, what the brain is doing to you, is not just your last night's sleep, but it's counting all the sleep you got in the entire week before, right? And it's keeping track of all that sleep. And you carry that sleep-wake history with you in your brain, and it will determine how good you are for your next assignment. So what that means, among other things, and you must, I will deny that I told you this, because the people that you work with are not going to like that I said that. If you must do an exam and you have to stay up at night and only just really quickly do the exam well, then you can get a lot of sleep deprivation, get one good night's sleep in, get the exam, do really well. See, I didn't say that. And you'll be good for that exam, but you are not going to be good for the rest of the week. It will still show, right? You're carrying it with you. So yes, it works for the exam, and I'm going to be honest, I would do the same thing. But you're going to have to get that sleep at some point. It's not going to help you for the rest of the week. You're going to carry it with you. And I think that's a really important thing to note, because we're always, just like everybody else, I'm pressed for time all the time, always in a hurry, always got things to do. But you can't cheat the system, right? You can't really cheat the system. It stays with you. And you're going to have to pay off that sleep debt at some point. But there are also large individual differences. There are large differences in how people respond to sleep deprivation. And this is data from an experiment with 24 people in it that all went through the same 40-hour sleep deprivation protocol. And let me first describe to you what we're seeing here. So this is, again, objective impairment on a reaction time task. Upwards is worse on this graph. Here's hours awake, 40 hours, up to 40 hours. And if you're a person who's vulnerable to sleep loss, who's actually affected by it much, the first 16 to 80 hours or so, nothing much happens, right? Because that's just a normal day. But then when the night begins, your performance degrades pretty quickly, gets really, really bad. And then if you stay up long enough, and again, I'm not going to tell you that you should do this, but you should maybe in a safe environment, try it once if you haven't. Only once. If you get through the morning and then you get into the next afternoon, you're actually going to be okay a little bit. Not great, not perfect, but you're going to be a little bit better, because your biological clock is telling you it's the daytime. You should be awake and you should be alert. It's going to help you out. Some people call this their second wind. So if you get through the more difficult morning hours, and of course, if you drink a lot of coffee, and then you get to the afternoon, it's getting better a little bit. And so that we see that here, right? It gets better. And then if you keep awake longer, then it gets worse and worse and worse yet. And we have those data, but it's not for today. That's for another day. But there are also people who don't really suffer any consequences for sleep deprivation much at all. These people, that's 7 out of the 24, have barely a little bit of a little bit of an impairment in the middle of the night, and then they're cruising along just fine. Now, one of the problems with this kind of data is that everybody is like, yeah, that's me. I'm this. Oh, oops, sorry. They're like, I'm this person. Well, let me tell you what we see when people ask people how sleepy they actually are, right? On top of the two, this is the data from these two groups now on subjective sleepiness. And you can see these very same people report the exact same levels of sleepiness. So now, if I come across somebody who says that I am okay to do a 40-hour work shift or something like that, or stay up for life, and they're all the same, should I trust their answer? Should I really trust them when they say, I'm okay, I'm going to be the person who's going to be okay? Because let's face it, if we get the chance to answer that question, most of us, maybe all of us, are going to say, yeah, I can do it. But half of us, maybe not. So this is really tricky, right? Because that means that, yes, some of us are really good at getting through to sleep deprivation, and we can do just fine under these circumstances. But we are no better than the other person who is maybe not so good at that, to actually know for ourselves if that's really true. We just don't know. And if you want to know if that also happens to people that are really like elite performers, and I'm not going to talk about doctors in a hospital or anybody else who is doing these really, really amazing things under conditions of insufficient sleep loss. I'm going to talk about fighter pilots in the US who, when it's not wartime, and let's knock on wood that we keep it that way, have to do practice exercises to keep their flight license up so they can actually fly if something happens. So these are US fighter pilots. This is the F-117A or the Nighthawk fighter plane. It's no longer in use, but at the time that the study was done, it was actually in use. And so fighter pilots that had been highly selected and gone through this grueling program with very difficult things that they needed to do and insufficient sleep and everything possible to be this elite force within the Air Force, would use this particular simulator here, which is the exact same thing as the actual plane, except it doesn't actually fly. But it's the exact same thing. They would use that in peacetime to keep up their license, and they would do these really complicated exercises where they would do like a 720-degree left turn. And for whatever reason, that's extremely difficult to do. And so they use it as a test exercise to see how well you can actually fly the plane, right? And it's very difficult. And there's a bunch of things you have to maintain a particular angle and a particular speed and it's very difficult to do. I don't even know how to explain it. But you can measure how well people do, among other things, by how far they are from the actual path, that they were supposed to fly. How far were they away from where they needed to be? And so there were these two pilots here that are shown. They were doing this night mission. They started in the evening and they were flying through the night and doing these exercises, these 720-degree turns, all the way through the next evening, late evening. And this pilot here in green was doing just fine. But this pilot, who was equally elite force and highly selected, was not doing so great in these early morning hours. Just like the nurses, right? It's the exact same pattern as we saw in the nurses. So if you looked at all 10 pilots that were part of this experiment, then they made up a beautiful distribution. We call that, if you plot that the proper way, you would call that a normal distribution. It was just, there's people that do well, there's people that do less well, there's people in the middle, just like everything else. And what it really showed us is that even these highly select operations where people are selected to be the best of the best and have trained under conditions of sleep loss and have done all these difficult things, they're just like everybody else. They're just human. It's the same biology. Works just the same as everybody else. And so you do not expect, and you cannot count on the fact that if you're in a special operations environment, in some other setting where people do really difficult things, you cannot count on the fact that all these people are going to be okay when they're sleep deprived, because they're not. They're just like you and me. So what can you do? Well, turns out that napping, taking a nap, is a really great countermeasure. If you can't get enough sleep, and let's face it, we all face that issue from time to time, right? You just can't get enough sleep. Turns out that taking a nap is a wonderful countermeasure. This is from an 88-hour sleep deprivation experiment. So the kind of experiment you do not want to do at home. But if you keep people awake for 88 hours straight, so skipping 1, 2, 3 nights, you get that same pattern we've seen before, where this is the first 40 hours, right? That looks familiar, right? And then it repeats itself, and it repeats itself. It gets just worse and worse and worse. It gets really, really bad, and it's very, very difficult to do. And at this point in time, most people cannot stay awake no matter how hard you try. But if you now give these safe people in the same experiment, different group, but same experiment, a 2-hour nap every 12 hours. So that's 4 hours per 24 hours in total, but 2-hour naps. One in the afternoon, one in the middle of the night, one in the afternoon, and so on. You can almost completely eliminate the performance impairment, right? So this is also something that you can never trace this back to me. I didn't say that. But if you must not have enough sleep, taking naps will allow you to, at least for the short run, will allow you to get away with that for a little bit. Now, we don't know what happened if you were to continue this for another 5 days or for months on end. Probably no good will come from that. But on the short run, naps are extremely powerful in keeping you going if you cannot otherwise get the sleep that you need. And so I am actually a big fan of napping as a countermeasure for fatigue because it is so effective, right? And the only thing you need for that, which is not a trivial thing, but the only place you need for that is a place where you can quietly just be away and take a nap. That's all you need. But unfortunately, nothing comes for free. And so napping comes with a side effect, which we call sleep inertia. It's that feeling of grogginess and disorientation and in sleepiness and impairment that you get when you have to get up. So now you've had a really lovely nap, and now they wake you up or your alarm goes, and now you're disoriented, right? And this, of course, in a real-world operational setting, like a hospital or like a military setting or like a fire station or what have you, if you have to wake up from a nap and now you're impaired because of sleep inertia, that's a problem because in principle you are more refreshed, but you still can't perform very well because you have this period for a while where you just things don't work very well for a bit. And so you have to sort of wear that off. One great way to wear that off is taking a shower. I know that's from personal experience. And people believe that it's the hot water that will make it happen for you, or the cold water, or whatever you fancy. But I actually think it's because you're just standing there for 20 minutes just doing nothing. But that's a debate for another day. But that sleep inertia is a problem because if you are in a hospital setting and there's a patient that needs attention, you can't afford to go away to take a shower for 20 minutes and come back later. That is not going to happen, right? That doesn't really work. So what can you do? Well, this is from the same experiment that I showed you just a minute ago, but now there was yet another additional condition in this experiment where people also got a 2-hour nap every 12 hours, but then they got caffeine gum. So a gum that was developed by the US military to just have caffeine in it. It gives you exactly 100 milligrams of caffeine. So that's just about roughly 1 cup of coffee. And but you can dose it very precisely. And when you do that, the sleep inertia completely disappears. So how can you use this then in practice? Well, you can either just buy the gum, or you can do what we're going to do in about 5 minutes or so, get our own coffee, right? Or you can, if you're really smart about it, it takes a little while for the caffeine to actually kick in because it needs to get into your system, needs to be digested and circulating, and then it starts working. So what you could also potentially do, and this is something that's under investigation right now in some more formal studies, you can try to take the caffeine before you take the nap. Take the nap, by the time that you wake up, it's now active in your system, and now you should be good to go. And what do we call that? Nappuccino. So with that, I want to leave some time for questions because I'm sure that you have plenty of questions about how you can make this work for yourself or for other people that you might know. I hope that I have been able to convince you that sleep loss, just like all the other speakers, I'm sure, I don't speak Spanish, but I know what you were talking about. Sleep loss is a problem. It's a serious problem. It can have really detrimental consequences, and we should all take it very seriously. But it's also a problem because sleep is time that we have to take away from wakefulness when we would like to do other things, right? So we all, most of us, probably all of us, don't really get enough sleep. So that has consequences. Napping is a great countermeasure. That has consequences too. You get sleep inertia. That's where caffeine comes in really well. I'm sure there are consequences of that too, but I'm just going to ignore that because coffee is nice. But this is a serious matter, right? So I'm making a little bit of a joke about it, but the sleep loss is a problem, and we should really take care of the sleep that we need. And the only solution that really works for all of these problems at the end of the day is to really get the sleep that you need and become more like the 8-hour people or the 9-hour people in these experiments and not like the 6 or the 4 hours, because the 9 hours and the 8 hours never really needed a nap. They were fine all along. And if you can do that, if you can do that even just part of your life, that would be worthwhile. With that, thank you very much. Okay, I see. I get lost in the who got first, but I saw a hand there first, but it's maybe just the highest one. So, but I'll get back to you second. Thank you. So please go ahead, ask a question.
Thank you so much. I believe I heard you before, and it was coffee nap. I really like more nappuccino. I think it's really quite sketchy.
I'm not the one who invented the term. Somebody else came up with it first, so
Okay.
can't take credit for it.
So the real thing is, at least here in Mexico, we're trying to start up like sleep clinics, and with facing the fact that the technicians and even ourselves have to make ourselves all the night. So how much can we shift the timing? I mean, there's now here in Mexico this debate about 40 hours of work at a week. So again, how can you make that into sleep schedules? So how much do you have to rest between these shifts? Because if you are a technician, you're mostly working at night, and some of them are also taking the qualifications during the day and so on and so forth. So how much can we spend sleeping to keep our brains alive, at least?
Yeah, you're asking some really, really important and difficult questions. Like, for instance, it's true, right? So we schedule people's work, and then we make the assumption that they will use the time when they're not working to catch up on sleep. But you have to study. You have to catch up on things. You have to do things while you're not working. And there is not a single occupation that I know of where there aren't also these other things that you also have to do that nobody talks about. It's not your work hours, but you have to do it still, right? You still have to take notes or transcribe your notes from your patients or whatever else. There's always something. So scheduling your time becomes a really difficult thing to do to begin with. And then if you ask me how much time do we really need off to recuperate, what is the best way to make this work? It turns out it's a complicated question. The biology is not very difficult to understand. But how it plays out, because it's highly nonlinear, is actually rather complex. And so I can take your example or somebody else's example, and I can take a mathematical model, which we have, and run through that and then calculate out what is a good solution for that person. But then somebody else comes along and says, well, why is my work schedule is a little bit different? I need to do it differently. And then we have to do this whole exercise again. I can't just give you one single answer. I need to then work through that and figure out, well, what if we try to put your sleep here? Or what if we give you a napping opportunity here? Or what if we see if we can make your work schedule shift by a couple hours? And then, of course, you can't really oftentimes do that because then somebody else will also have to shift with you, right? But if you talk about a whole organization, for instance, because I do some consulting with companies for that sort of stuff, And we can look at the entire organization and we can say, well, what if we shift everybody a couple hours here or a couple hours there? Can we make it better? And the answer oftentimes is that, can you make it perfect? No. The moment you have to work at night, it's never going to be great. It's just not how this works. But you can oftentimes make it better or less bad, if you will, right? And so I think there are ways to do that, but to give you a one-shot answer, like do it this way, I wish I could. Actually, I don't, because then I would be out of work. But but it's not that simple. But we can do it. What we're going to do then is we're going to take the mathematical equations that describe how all this works, and we're going to actually put it into a computer system. And I think nowadays you can probably do it with artificial intelligence, but we can do it with normal intelligence too. And then we're going to shift it, and we're going to say, let's look at where we see problems, and let's find out if we can make those problems go away by maybe just do a nap here, or maybe put a shorter shift here and then make this one longer, or something like that, right? And so that's how you can do that. And so there's a good example of operational settings that have made this actually work. Like if you go to aviation, and this is across the entire world. This happens here in Mexico, this happens in the US, this happens in Europe, this happens in Australia, it happens in Asia too. So you know what you need to do. You've got passengers here, and they need to go to there, right? And then so you have this network of things that need to happen. And you've got planes, and you've got pilots that are qualified to fly these planes. And you can put all of that into a computer, and you can say to the computer, now tell me which schedule would be the best to make these passengers go from here to there with minimal cost for fuel and other things, but also at the same time accounting for the fact that the pilots need to be alert, that the flight attendants need to be alert, that the ground crews loading and unloading the plane need to be alert, right? And put that all into a big system and then say, now optimize this for me. And this happens every day. In the entire world, this kind of exercise happens every day on these really big computers that you and I cannot afford, but they can. But if you have a smaller operation, and you just have a laptop, and you've got like an Excel spreadsheet that I could actually share with you, you can do some of this by yourself too, right? It's not actually, it's not simple, but it's not complicated enough that you need an entire IT department for it either. So you can optimize the schedule, and you can make better choices. And I think that's what we would like to do, because it's never going to be perfect. This is just not how this works. But you can try to optimize and make it less bad that way. I know that that's a convoluted answer, and it's not the one-shot thing that we all want to hear, but that's how we do that, and it's possible. Thank you. I saw a question over there.
Well, good morning as well. And well, first I want to say that it was really interesting all that you said. And as you mentioned before, my question is focused on that part that do we have a particular time in the day where we can take a nap? And maybe at 2 p.m. or what is that time? Well, considering that sometimes we have different activities that are in different schedules, you know? So what is the best time for taking a nap during the day?
So if you are having a quote-unquote regular schedule where you're getting up in the early morning, if you will, and staying up until about the late evening, but not all the way to the night, and if you're not getting enough sleep just already at night, you're going to have a little bit of this sleepiness is going to still be with you when you wake up in the morning, right? And it turns out that if you then follow the trajectory of your homeostatic sleep pressure as it builds up across the day, and you follow what your biological clock is doing, the natural point in time when the pressure for wakefulness from the biological clock is not high enough yet, and your sleep is starting to build up, and that's sort of your highest point in the day, is what we would typically call known as siesta time, which is a little bit different for you and for me and for everybody, but somewhere between 1 p.m., 3 p.m., maybe 4 p.m., that's a roughly period, right? So, and you will feel it. We oftentimes associate that same time with lunch. And then so we call that the postprandial dip or the post-lunch dip. But it has nothing to do with what you're eating. It's just your biology that's causing that to happen at that particular time. But it's peculiar because that's when you have a typical daytime schedule. But if you're a nighttime person, if you're working nights or you're just somebody who likes to work through the night, it doesn't play out that way. And for them, that would not be the right answer. They would have a better time for a nap that's somewhere else. But there's one consistent thing that everybody experiences. As long as you're not traveling across time zones, and so your biological clock is actually in sync with where you are, the late afternoon, early evening hours, we call that the wake maintenance zone. That's when your biological clock is really active in telling you this is a great time to be awake. Forget it. You're not going to get a nap then. It's not going to let you do it, right? So try the early afternoon. Don't try the late afternoon, because then once you get to that point, it won't let you. And even if you do get that nap, it will be short. Now, if you find that you will still be able to sleep at that time also, you go see a doctor. Because then you might have a sleep disorder, right? And then something is wrong.
Thank you so much.
Don't worry, it's a real quick question. It's a personal question. I usually start to sleep at 5 a.m., 6 a.m.
Okay.
And I usually wake up at 12 p.m. where I say, no, I'm lazy to wake up, so I'm just going to sleep a little bit more. So I wake up at 1 p.m. I'm still lazy. I sleep again. Then I wake up at 2 p.m.
Yeah.
And I continue. So I don't know if it's healthy for me. I mean, I don't think so, but I feel good after all.
Well, so this is a difficult question to answer, in part because we're getting into the territory where you might have a sleep disorder, and I am not a medical doctor, and I cannot judge that, and I will not going to try. But we also know that there are people who are naturally late persons, right? And so they tend to just go to bed much later in the night, and then they sleep into the day. And so there's two parts of this story. There's what's your biological clock doing? And so we have people that are morning type people or larks, as we call them, or evening type people or owls. And there are some people that are extreme evening type people that just really don't go to bed until the night's almost over. And that's natural variation. But it's rare, but it's not unheard of, right? So it happens. And then there's also how well can you resist the effect that you're maybe not getting enough sleep, and how well can you function? And so there are people, maybe like you, maybe not, who can function just fine under these circumstances. And if you feel that that's you, and if there's nobody else tells you that you have a big problem, then maybe things are okay. But I can also tell that you're a little bit worried about it, right? And so if you're a little bit worried about it, I imagine that, I've got to be careful what I say here. I don't want to cause anybody any work, but there are people here in the room who are actual medical doctors. Have a quick chat with them. See what they think, right? And so, because in case of doubt, you might want to get that checked out just to make sure that you are okay. Because you can maybe fix it now, but 20 years from now, much harder.
Thank you so much, indeed. I need a doctor. Nice conference, by the way.
Thank you.
Very interesting.